Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of our conference, The Philippines, Spain, and Globalization, 16th century to the present. We are in session 9 and we are in panel 9 with the title Embodying Christianity and Colonialism. We have 5 papers for this panel, with the first one by Maria Rita Lourdes Arce Alfaro from Ateneo de Manila University with a paper titled Women's Bodies and Colonial Justice. The second paper is from Sara Mediatrix Toraldo of Ateneo de Manila University, Pedagogy of the Body, Images of Children in Primary School Textbooks in Spanish Philippines, 1863 to 1898. The third paper is by Katherine Lacson, The Clash of Images. Dr. Lacson is also from Ateneo de Manila University. And then the fourth paper by Jopol Alvin C. Ancheta with a paper titled Godparenthood, Ethnicity and Occupation, a late 19th century case study of Molo, Iloilo. And the last paper of this panel is by Francis Anthea R. Redison, Rereading Christianity and Anticolonialism, the Yawa-Yawa's Search for the Santo Niño. We will have all papers presented one after the other with no further introductions. Again, please keep your mics and videos turned off. And you may share the Facebook link because we are being live streamed via Facebook. Without further ado, Rita, you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you, Prof. Pante. Okay. So let's talk about women's bodies and colonial justice. How much did the colonial laws of the 19th century interfere into the colonial woman's body? Forward on to the 21st century, how much of these colonial laws continue to encroach upon the woman's body and her choices? So let's look at the intersection of gender, crime, and colonial justice in Spanish colonial Philippines, geared towards the realization that the laws then in place in the 19th century that policed women's bodies and women's choices in the 19th century are the same laws that continue to invade and encroach and colonize women's bodies at present. So the laws then remain to be, regrettably, the laws in place now. So let's look at the dynamics between the woman, her body, her choices in this topic versus colonial state controls, underscoring at the same time that these state controls were hewn from archaic laws. Imagine in the 19th century, the laws in place were already archaic because they were hewn from Roman law, the Napoleonic Code, and the Spanish laws in all its incarnations, influenced by the Cadiz Constitution, the Bourbon reforms, the Siete Partidas, no? And imagine that the laws then were already archaic, and now in 2020, these are the laws that continue to be in place. So there is a call for legal reforms, no, in the present. So let's take a look at the colonial order of the 19th century colonial legal system. Now, of course, as with any colonial social order, the noble idea is of maintaining harmony among the colony and its inhabitants, its subjects. However, in the 19th century, it was fraught with limitations. There was uniform application of laws among all of Spain's colonies. So imagine it was in place regardless of the context of each colony. The only context that was pervading was that the colonial government on one hand and the subjugated peoples on the other. Secondly, there was the issue of competency of the colonial judicial tribunal. There was this comment, there was this back and forth of official missives criticizing, no, those people who were tasked with the dispensation of justice, that stated a lackey or a hairdresser can even hold a judicial office. So imagine that. And there is the multiplicity of subjects. You have peninsulares on one hand, you have the insulares on the other, you have the subjugated Indio, the mestizos, the sangleyes, and male and female. So what were the laws in place then? No, we have the Spanish Criminal Code enacted in 1885, following a royal decree in 1884 and promulgated in 1887. Now, this doesn't mean that prior to 1885 or 1884 even, that there were no laws in place, that there was anarchy in the Philippines. No, there was relative application of all existing Spanish laws in all of the colonies of Spain. However, it was in 1884, by virtue of that royal decree, that laws were codified to be promulgated, to be executed in the colonies of Spain. So we now have the 1887 Spanish Civil Code, as you can see in the slide. That's the cover of the Spanish Civil Code in place in the Philippines. But then the comments of those who were already tasked with dispensing justice was that, how do we now apply this versus existing laws in Spain? Okay, the same reaction um, met the Código Civil, the Spanish Civil Code of May 1888, which was extended to the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, among these colonial laws, were two particular crimes that I chose so that it can best exemplify how the state is so much invested in the woman's body and her choices. So the colonized woman's choices over reproductivity, over her bodily disposition, as in the case of an exercise of a profession, were all under the control and ownership of the state, as it would seem. So does this sound familiar? It continues to be the situation in present times. No? So I chose these crimes of abortion and prostitution to exemplify how the state can interfere and encroach upon the woman's choices and her body. So we have here abortion. Abortion is a crime that pertains to the expulsion and death of an unborn fetus and might be committed three ways: by concealment of dishonor. So the scenario being, a woman who gets pregnant out of wedlock wants to conceal her dishonor and thus may resort to abortion. Unintentionally, abortion can be exercised or carried out through violent means. Violence is carried out against a pregnant woman, thereby causing abortion. And it can be intentional. So a case that I found, well, two cases to exemplify of abortion that I found from the archives would be the tale of two Fabianas. Now, going back to the intentional abortion, abortion carried out intentionally, would be a pharmacist having to be made to answer for the crime by exercising or administering a draft and abortifacient. Now, anyway, let's now go to these two cases. I call this the tale of two Fabianas. So this Fabiana Sales case, in this case, it would seem that it was a family affair to commit abortion, wherein the father, quote and unquote, inadvertently facilitated his daughter's consumption of an abortifacient. No? So the father gave his daughter a draft or a juice made from cacao root, the naif de cacao, which was then a known abortifacient. And thus, drinking it caused her to expel the fetus from her womb. So we can safely assume that the family did not agree to that pregnancy. Now, the act of administration of this draft was testified upon the domestic servants of the household, by the criadas, the criadas. However, as a segue, this case was dismissed by the courts, for lack of sufficient evidence that will charge or that will sufficiently charge the father of abortion. Note that in the case, as I read the case, there were several documents within this particular folder. the family of Fabiana Sales were identified to be of good reputation. They were mestizos, no, and that it could not happen. It couldn't be that they will commit this abominable crime. Okay. Now another case of Fabiana would be the Fabiana Pahatol case. No, she was 15 years old. She was identified as India Soltera, a local woman, and a single local woman, who also wanted to conceal her pregnancy, but she was charged. She was found guilty of this crime of abortion. So you find that there are two of three ways by which abortion can be held. So in this case, you can see that the woman's choice over her body, of hiding her dishonor. Note that the state understands that the woman would want to hide her dishonor, but even so, will penalize it, or will punish her for it, for the exercise of the choice. Okay, so that will also be the same in prostitution. Okay, now in prostitution, there were several provisions of law that came into play, no, in discussing prostitution. If you were to look at the Spanish Civil Code, there is not one special provision about prostitution, but you will find it elsewhere, embedded in some other provision. No, so not like now that you have a special provision for it, well, special provisions for it. So what found application in the adjudication of prostitution would be the 1822 Spanish Criminal Code, which defines prostitution as a shameful commerce, quote and unquote, vergonzoso tráfico, no? And punishes the woman engaged in that, not only her, but as well as her pimp, or a person who facilitates or procures that shameful commerce. Another set of laws that found application in the adjudication of prostitution would be the 1887 Spanish Criminal Code, wherein a person, perhaps a guardian or even a parent who facilitates prostitution of his wife or daughter, or a ward, is punished by law, as well as a procurer, a pimp, no? Through the abuse of authority, would facilitate such dastardly crime. Now, a woman charged with prostitution, um, if you were to look at the records, no, these were all the terms, no, that sought to define a woman's actions, because it was not prostitution right there then. There would be terms like scandalous behavior, or scandalous or suspicious behavior, immorality and scandal, or even, well, it's only in the late 1890s that the actual term practice of prostitution can be read from the expedientes, no, the charge sheets, the rap sheets against these women charged with this crime. Now, the woman's body is definitely very political. The state is invested, is interested in the disposition of which. The existing state controls then criminalizes and punishes a woman's exercise of autonomy over her own body. No, and this is my advocacy, that there is a dire need to re-examine our laws to consider the special circumstance of gender. It cannot be one size fits all. And it cannot be, I'm not advocating for decriminalizing abortion or prostitution, but if indeed the state will criminalize it, and there should be safeguards, there should be controls that should take care of the criminal, because we charge a person for doing something outside or that is against the moral or social fabric, but it is towards the end of reforming the criminal. So if you intend to reform the criminal, then there is a dire need of taking into consideration the special circumstance of gender, vis-a-vis class, vis-a-vis other special conditions attendant to every commission of each crime. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so good
And
afternoon to everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about the clash of images. So these are narratives, discourses, and images of the ideal Filipina in periodicals from 1898 to 1938. Okay, so to start, what was the conception of the ideal Filipina? The consequent and influential periods of colonization brought about socially constructed images of the ideal Filipina. This question proved contentious as the narratives and images of the modern Filipina during the American period clashed head on with her more traditional representations from the Spanish period. So, utilizing the power of text and iconography found in print media extant from 1898 to 1938, this presentation examines the various perspectives and concerns on this subject as the story of the Filipina evolved with the times. In this medium, brisk and dynamic discussions created the various clashes concerning the image of the ideal Filipina. So the periodical, as we all know, is part of daily life, and as pointed out by Adrian Bingham, by using newspapers as a source material, it is possible to explore a wide range of images and debates to see how a variety of different gender discourses interacted, interlinked, and contrasted. With periodicals, one can explore the meaning, the impact, and the alterations of these representations when placed alongside other contrasting images. So, a historical feminist lens and Alan McKee's interrogation of Habermas's ideas on the separate spheres ideology was utilized to look into the various interpretations, interrogations, and discussions as the Filipina found herself in the middle of a collision between traditional and modern perceptions. So before I continue, I would like to say that this presentation that I'm showing you right now is from a few parts of the dissertation that I defended last June 2017. I have around 28,000 images and text, so I had to muddle, in order for me to be able to muddle through, I have to acknowledge Dr. Stephanie Koo, whose methodology helped me out with the creation of my database. And of course, the guidance of Professor Xavier, who without it, I would be lost and would never have finished. So thank you to these two people. So, to continue, the Filipina gained more agency and influence in the public sphere during the American period due to her various activities. Women were present in the growth and changes that were happening in the country. They were part of the fight for independence. They defined and redefined the roles in the political sphere as she fought for the right to the ballot and for the right to run for public office. They became more active as economic actors in the world of business and work. They were front runners in social reform and were participants in the creation of a consumer culture. They took opportunities to advance their learning through education. And as she became more active in the public sphere, the stronger the clashing of ideas concerning her image became, especially since these discussions affected how she moved around and represented herself in the public sphere. So the more modern her image became during the American period, the more it was compared to conceptions of the ideal Filipina of the Spanish period. So what were the issues that would be compared and contrasted by writers and readers in the periodicals, in the newspapers and the magazines? The first one was the conception of the ideal in relation to what can be seen on the outside, meaning her looks, her body, and her clothing. The next one is the usage of the image of the Maria Clara versus the modern Filipina. And of course, issues on femininity versus masculinity, family values, virtues, and morality were also compared and contrasted. So what I'm going to be showing to you right now would be just some examples of these things, because there's really a lot, no? So the first part would be about her beauty role. And one of the ones that were really hit by it were the suffragists, who were very popular, very, very prominent, educated ladies who found strong adversaries in those who believed that the women would actually lose their beauty if they were to gain the power to the ballot, which is this editorial cartoon actually shows. No, most illustrations would be recreating them like ugly, grumpy old maids who needed a major makeover. So when you have this, on the other spectrum, women in the working world, many were stereotyped as temperamental and emotional creatures that just focused on their looks. They were stigmatized for parlorizing the workplace, yet were expected to look like they'd just been to the parlor when they went to work. No? So these are some of the issues. There's a lot, no, when it comes to the idea of the beauty role of the woman and the image of before and after. Another issue is basically about clothing, no? Photos in the periodicals usually show the changing outfits and hemlines. It goes up and up and up, no? So questions of morality and values usually arose in this discussion, specifically those working women in the entertainment business. Vaudeville women could be seen in various forms of déshabille. These photos, combined with news and gossip about the show, strengthened the discussion about propriety and modesty due to their manner of dressing. Conservatives and traditionalists did not view their clothes as coming from the latest and most aristocratic Paris modists, but were more suggestive of luridness and immorality. To counter this image, vaudeville actresses such as Katie and Dimples Cooper were consciously featured wearing conservative dresses on their days off to put emphasis on the fact that offstage they led very wholesome and very normal lives. No, film actresses would even put it a step further in their glamour shots where they were wearing balintawaks and ternos. No, Evelyn, a screen actress, would even state that I am a modern girl, yet I'm not modern at all. I'll never be a flapper. And another screen actress named Rosita Rivera would even be featured stating that she was really very Catholic and went to church twice a week. So these would be the images that would be shown, no? And at the same time, the realities that will be happening, the things that they will be living in their reality. No? Okay. So how about the everyday working girl? Mrs. Felicidad Cabales, who was a woman auditor, chose to actually wear a mestiza because she was saying that it was her way to give her dignity in social and official interactions. From her own words, she stated, I'm afraid that if I wore foreign dresses, men will not respect me, especially since she was the only woman in the department for the longest time. So this showed you the precarious state that a lot of women found themselves in as they fought to regain respect, both as a woman and as an equal in the world of men. So for working women, clothes should be simple and attractive, but not loud. And of course, as pointed out by the first speaker, no, Rita, the body of the woman is always politicized, no? And one of the parts of the body that was politicized during this time was the head, no, the hair specifically. And the question of the times were to bob or not to bob, no? So public opinion was divided on this act of shearing one's golden mane. There were those who believed that it was the true image of progress, but naysayers felt that bobbing one's hair lessened the beauty and femininity of women. Judge, as you can see, right, no, from that to that, nasan ka buhok, no? So, Judge Simplico del Rosario, one of the strongest characters in the Philippine judiciary, stated that if I were a young man, I would never marry a girl who had bobbed hair. And the feelings of moralists who were so aggravated by the bobbed hair even introduced a bill seeking a levy to levy an annual tax of 30 pesos upon any girl of 15 years and over who sported cropped hair. While the bill was pending, interestingly enough, beauty parlors and barber shops became inundated with a never-ending stream of women who wanted to assert their independence from these man-made laws. Luckily enough, this bill didn't push through, no? Okay, so aside from the body, the outside, the exterior, the looks, no? There was also the issue of the Maria Clara versus the modern Filipina. So the college women were usually described as the epitome of a modern young lady in her looks, in her attitude, and in her behavior. She usually sported the bobbed hair, used the latest fads in cosmetics, and preferred wearing Western fashions that were in vogue. She had an active lifestyle and had strong opinions and was very well educated. So she seemed to be the complete antithesis of the image of the Filipina during the Spanish period, who supposedly was more homely, more retiring, more submissive, more modest, more feminine, a true Maria Clara. So these were notions that were being pushed forward by people like Perfecto Lagyao in the House of Representatives, who believed that the modern co-ed were sophisticates, painted dolls, vampires even, and gold diggers. He was one of those people who pined for the days when the woman was more like the Maria Clara. No? But Pasita de los Reyes, the 1934 Carnival Queen, stated that fundamentally the Filipino woman has not changed a bit. Superficially, I think that the modern woman is much better than Maria Clara. The former is more popular, and she sees no reason for the existence of wallflowers. No? So this idea of the Maria Clara versus the modern Filipina would also even be utilized where in the granting of the ballot. No? How was it utilized? So it was used to actually jockey and stop bills, such as the Cuenco Bill in 1926, which was one of those bills that almost ended up being passed, no, so that the women can finally get the vote, but was derailed. And it was derailed by a speech that was done by Claro M. Recto, no. Before the voting, he decided to have a dramatic turn and spoke up his mind and stated, "Our ideal deity, Maria Clara, from man's infamy, be shielded by closing the temple to the mad ravings of the political carnivals." And he addressed his fellow members, "Your responsibility before history, should you approve the bill, will be like that of a man who carried away from the altars the goddess of his devotions in order to compel her to dance in the excesses of an orgy." So with that speech, he was able to derail the Cuenco Bill, and the Cuenco Bill wasn't passed. No? Okay, so Dr. Mendoza Guazon would really point out, no, in this article that you will see here, that Maria Clara did not really deserve admiration, no, and that the character in Rizal's novel was not really intended as a paragon by Rizal. So this is actually a very interesting article that pointed it out. So again, the clash of images were happening, the clash of text, the clash of iconography, no. So aside from the Maria Clara versus the modern Filipina, again, the issues of femininity versus masculinity would also be coming out. And again, in the issue of emancipation, journalists like Federico Mangahas, known for his ambivalence towards women and defender of the bastion of manhood, sarcastically pointed out that this emancipation from emancipation, which is about the brightest prospect that women's suffrage hold, will come when it becomes definitely settled in the women's minds that it is to their best interest to remain women and not become like men. Okay. And so another lady would be stating that, named Amparo Neri, who was actually against suffrage, believed that the men representing women's interests strengthened the bond between husband and wife. And she wrote, "A brilliant, ambitious woman would better serve her country by voicing her opinions through the influence of her husband." Another writer named Esteban Mayo would second this, no? And he would state that there is nothing dearer to the Filipino woman than her husband. If she has to vote, she will yield her convictions to those of her husband, and the sacredness of the franchise will be jeopardized, trampled on, and violated so that the posted stability of our government will be at stake. And as you can see, there's a comic strip on the side, right? Now, which actually goes to show you that these are two images that were clashing, no? And these were the things that were happening during that time. And this comic strip is really very interesting when you think about it, no? Okay. So, and Maud Parker would state that Maud Parker is one of the suffragists here in the Philippines. She would be stating that as long as women don't make their fathers, husbands, sweethearts, and friends uncomfortable and ashamed that they are being denied, then nothing will happen, because we should have an effective voice in the national affairs, no? So even women in the working world would be affected by this issue of femininity versus masculinity. This illustration perfectly encapsulated this issue concerning the images of those who had more feminine jobs as compared to women who had jobs that were known to be more masculine. The teacher and the nurse, as you can see in the slide, are caricatured, in their caricatured form remained feminine, svelte, young, and elegant. They were educators and caregivers, which were seen as a continuance of the work of women in the private sphere. The caricature of lawyers, judges, and police women did not have the same feminine treatment, as they were portrayed as old, plump, and masculine. The images of these women who work in male-dominated industries were intimidating, imposing, insinuating the idea that one cannot take a position of power or work, usually done or connoted to men, without becoming or gaining their masculine characteristics. The article was written to prove that despite their work, as the title succinctly put it in exclamation terms, no, they are still women, you know, but coming from a point of view that each woman, whether she was doing an occupation known to be female-dominated or male-dominated, did not lose their spark of femininity, as if being a strong professional woman cannot be possibly feminine at the same time. This slide alone, or this illustration alone, would have so many you could actually create so many discussions and discourses on just this one, no? So another issue with the femininity versus the masculinity is the education being given to women. They were stating that because the women were now being educated, they're more mannish. So Miss Maria R. Valdez, who was the UP Director of Women, pointed out that even though there was a rapid change in the character of the college girls, as they were no longer the little, timid, shrinking violet, the clinging creatures of a decade or two ago, she emphatically stated that she was not championing the forward and mannish girl. Far from it. She's one of my pet aversions, but I believe a girl can be educated and independent without the same time losing her natural modesty, which is the crown of womanhood. And I think the last point that I'm going to be talking right now would be about the mother. No? The separate spheres ideology created a very clear delineation between the worlds of work and home. The entrance of women in the public sphere created a frenzy from conservatives and traditionalists who wanted to make sure that the family unit, which was the priority of women, should not be forgotten. Some women were not even permitted by their husbands to work, and many working women had to defend their rights to have jobs. Mrs. Asuncion Perez, a very well-known social worker during that time, opined that it is not improper for a woman to undertake outside work, because she can always be able to devise something to balance both things, no? Both work at home and work outside. No? So to sort of close this, the modern ideas concerning the Filipina ideal espoused during the American period clashed with the more traditional ideas of her from the Spanish period, which heightened the awareness of changing gender ideals. She faced an array of political, economic, social, and cultural challenges. Those who defended the traditional images of the Filipina was wistful for a past ideal of a woman who was feminine, modest, simple, and who knew her rightful place was in the home to serve her husband and family. These defenders of tradition denigrated the modern Filipina, who, due to her supposed maternity, has become artificial in her looks due to the cosmetics she wore, more masculine due to her activities, her education, and her foray into the public sphere, and too independent in her own ways, and even more immoral in the way she dressed and she gallivanted around. As Bingham wrote, newspapers contrasted old and new versions of femininity and emphasized the challenge that modern young women posed to convention. So the clash of images, due to the two consequent and influential periods of colonization, created constructions, contradictions, and ambiguities that are still very much present in the life of the contemporary Filipina. And so the story continues. Thank you. That's it.
I'll be your third speaker. I'm from UP Diliman, assistant professor of Department of History. A late 19th century case study of Molo, Iloilo. So to introduce the topic, Godparenthood studies in the Philippines is highly inadequate. Almost all of these few but noteworthy studies were anthropological in approach and almost contemporaneous in the time that they were written. It is always the case since anthropologists were the first to study this long-standing tradition and were in the world since the late 19th century in Europe and of course in Latin America. Historians and demographers just came to the scene 30 years ago. On the other hand, there were few studies on historical godparenthood in the Philippines which use parish registers as primary sources. One is Mark Dison's Social and Spiritual Kinship in early 18th century Caraballo Mountains, and the other is by Rosil Mujares in a chapter in his book Theater and Society, Society and Theater, Social History of a Cebuano Village. By doing an inquiry into this lasting church practice, one can uncover varying strategies of families and individuals in their selection of godparents, which is of course vital in maintaining, building, and strengthening relations and networks within and outside a locality. This study could also help in determining the crucial role played by spiritual kinship as an instrument in the formation of elite linkages. This study could generate knowledge that could contribute to the limited scholarship of historical godparenthood in the Philippines, which can be beneficial to students, scholars of social history, cultural history, history of family, local history, and demographic history. So given the inadequate discussion on the topic, new studies are necessary to unravel the aspects or different aspects of godparenthood and verify historical assertions. Historiography maintains the assumption that a person chooses a godparent based on his or her socioeconomic background and not really on their capacity to hone God's child's Catholic upbringing. These studies suggest that parents choose the godparent of their child among the upper class, if not from their social equals, but rarely below their socioeconomic status. Hence, this study would examine these assertions on godparenthood using selected demographic data during the late 19th century. In relation to this study aspires to answer the following. What are the profile of the parents and their co-parents with regard to occupation and ethnicity? Are there patterns in the selection of godparents among the locality? And of course, what are the implications of this? So the methodology of the study, it's a mixed methods approach, quantitative and qualitative approach. So first is historical and historiographical data analysis. Making a historical narrative is, of course, the primal goal of history writing. Using careful scrutiny of sources, this study attempts to construct a history of practice of godparenthood in the Philippines, and of course, a history of local narrative of Molo. Aside from qualitative method, a quantitative method or approach is used through aggregative data analysis of parish registers, particularly the Libros Bautismos of Molo, Iloilo. So this method is commonly used in studying history of local populations because of its capacity to explore trends and patterns drawn from local events such as baptism. So let's talk about godparenthood. As the predominant religion in the Philippines, Catholicism has certain long-standing traditions that are prevalent and even relevant up to this day. One of these is godparenthood. This tradition underwent many changes throughout history. Originally, the church allowed multiple godparents, but it was eventually prohibited by the Council of Trent in 1563, wherein the church prescribed a godparent depending on the sex of a child, or at most 2 godparents, or the so-called couple model. So this model was introduced in the Philippines by the Spaniards during the early colonial period as an essential part of conversion, particularly baptism, the first sacrament. Basically, along with catechism, godparenthood became a colonial tool by the colonizers to pacify the natives and embrace the new faith. So in the Catholic religion, baptism did not just represent a solemn and social recognition of the biological birth of the child. Rather, it also represents the spiritual birth or the second birth. A birth within a group of family normally different from that based on blood relations, thus spiritual family, composed of godfather and the godmother. And of course, as we all know, godparents serve as spiritual teachers to their godchild. That is for the godchild to become good Catholics by guiding them in the following teachings of the church. More so, godparenthood produces a distinct relationship called ritual kinship between godparent and the godchild, as well as the godparents and the parents of the child. In essence, the godparents became the secondary parents of the child, or the so-called co-parents, or the more popular terms such as compadrasgo or comparatico in Italian. However, historically, godparenthood ties had great social importance. It was used not just for spiritual purposes, but for other pragmatic functions as well, such as, again, building social patronage and strengthening existing relations. So foreign and even local literature maintains the assumption that a person chooses a godparent based on his or her socioeconomic background and not really on their capacity to hone the godchild's Catholic upbringing. So basically, the purpose of this study is to test these assumptions. First, parents choose godparents of their child from their own peers or co-equals. Second, if the situation permits, parents choose their godparents of their child from a socioeconomic status higher than their own. And lastly, parents rarely choose godparents from socioeconomic status lower than them. So that's the premise of, or that's the historical assertions throughout the history of godparenthood. So let's talk about our setting, Molo, which is currently part of Iloilo. So Molo is one of the constituent districts of Iloilo, along with Arevalo, Haro, La Paz, Lapus, Mandurriao, and of course the Iloilo city proper. So as you can see in the map, Molo is the yellow portion in the coastal area of Iloilo. So during the beginnings of Spanish colonization, Molo was already known as the Chinese enclave in the region, which preceded even the foundation of modern-day Iloilo City proper. The presence of Chinese infidels, Molo was also the site of the bitter rivalry, for example, between the Jesuits and the Dominicans in the 17th and 18th century. Molo, however, was not the earliest settlement in the region, but Oton. This village was located between the modern-day town of Oton and district of Arevalo. So it was formerly known as Ogton, and eventually it was known as Oton. So in 1581, Governor General Ronquillo de Peñalosa founded the town of Arevalo, and the new village also became the capital of the province of Oton. So due to the presence of Chinese traders in Oton, General Ronquillo also established a market and a Chinese quarter in Arevalo, which then became Molo. So the Jesuits controlled the parish of Molo until their expulsion from the colony in 1768. And the Dominicans took over the parishes of Molo and of course the other parishes in parts of Oton for the next 7 years. And in the late 18th century, Molo along with Arevalo became an independent parish with its own secular priest. At the period of study, which is in 1883, the parish priest was Agustin Buenaflor. Meanwhile, I think which is more important for this topic, the economic aspect of Molo, the potential was the commercial potential was already observed by the Spaniards and foreigners alike. In the late 1860s, in the mid 18th century, this potential started to materialize when the colonial government and the inhabitants tapped the textile trade of Molo to supply the domestic needs, eventually the international needs of the world. By 19th century, Molo, along with Haro and Arevalo, became the textile center of the country. However, in the late 1860s, this was challenged and eventually defeated by the burgeoning sugar industry, which forever, of course, changed the economic landscape, not only of Iloilo, but the Philippine economic history. The sugar trade shifted the employment of inhabitants of Molo to Iloilo City proper and Negros. And the mestizo families of Molo also invested their wealth in the new industry, and some of them even transferred to Negros to personally handle the sugar production. All of these events in the late 19th century Iloilo changed the social milieu of Molo, and its importance cannot be understated in assessing the profile of Godparenthood in the region. So Molo's most recognizable feature is the Church of St. Anne Parish, or popularly known as the Molo Church, the only Gothic revival church outside of Manila. The original construction of the church dates back to 1831. However, its present style was built in the 1870s when the plan was approved by Bishop Mariano Cuartero. Since then, the church was visited by pilgrims and faithful, particularly the women. It is known as the Women's Church because it is adorned by statues of 16 women saints, and the centerpiece located in the altar is a figure of Saint Anne with the child Mary. So the spires of the church tower over the Molo and can be seen outside the vicinity of the district and even from the coast of Guimaras, which is a nearby island province in the south. So due to its height, the Molo Church was included in the seafarers' charts as one of the markers of Iloilo coast, a testament to the church's secular use. So let's talk about the baptismal register, the main demographic data that were used for this paper. So the baptismal register is part of the Libros Canonicos, which is the baptismal register, marriage registers, and burial registers. So due to the role of church in Spanish colonial administration, parish priests act as local bookkeepers and, well, statisticians because of their actual presence in community, unlike Spanish officials. These registers varied across time and place. Some are more or less complete. Others do not give the same amount of information, such as the grandparents or the godparents' profile. Ultimately, the pattern and veracity of baptismal registers would depend on the parish priest and some of the parish assistants. That is why this is a tedious process, since the researcher needs to choose a parish with sufficient qualitative and quantitative data that can back up one's observation and, of course, interpretation. So fortunately, Molo records from 1883 have the same or more detailed amount of information which would help us better profile the locality. So the following are the information that can be found in baptismal entry of Molo from 1883. So the date of baptism, the name of the priest, the pueblo, date of the birth of the child, the name, legitimacy, the father's name, title, ethnicity, residence, occupation, and the same with the mother, and even the grandparents' name and residence were included. And of course, the main focus of this paper, the godparents' name, titles, civil status, ethnicity, residence, occupation. But we'll just focus on the occupation and ethnicity of the godparents stated in the registers. So the analytic population of children under 1 year of age is 291. So there are 291 childbirths in 1883 based on the records. The total number of children and the godparents are not the same, as there are children who had more than one godparent during their baptism. In total, there were 15 sets of parents who opted to choose 2 godparents, while majority chose a single godparent. So this table shows the background characteristics of the children or the infant. So the table shows more than half of all baptisms in Molo are female. So they were 151 female infants, while 140 infants are male. So with regards to legitimacy, about 3 in 4 infants are legitimate children, while a sizable minority of 23% are legitimate. So legitimacy was determined by the recognition of the church and the colonial state of the parents' marriage. Unexpectedly, couple must receive first the sacrament of matrimony before having a child based on traditional church laws. Of course, this is not realistic because this is not always the case. Well, since time immemorial, since couples were already engaging in premarital sex, which is the reason for the illegitimacy of the child during this, up to this day. So, we can also speculate, but it's just a speculation that the illegitimacy can also be caused by extramarital affair. Another possible reason was the instances of casual sex or even prostitution that might serve the ports and the influx of foreigners in the region. Again, one can only speculate, but the absence of fathers in the registers is highly conspicuous. So based on the entries, there was a significant minority of desconocidos or the unknown fathers, which represents 23% of all registers or 67 missing cases. So due to the lack of sources related to the unknowns, one cannot ascertain the identities of these missing fathers. But one thing is certain, there was a prevalence of sex outside of marriage in 1982-1983 Molo, Iloilo. So aside from legitimacy, the baptismal registers can also provide the ethnicity of the child, which is based on the ethnicity of the parents. Interestingly, despite the Chinese mestizo class being a known minority in Molo, the table shows that all of the infants were classified as Indio or native-born Filipino. That is not to say that every child had Indio parents. Some child had mestiza sangle or Chinese mestiza for a mother, but of course, during this time, the status of the father precedes the status of the mother. So marrying an India or marrying a mestizo would have mestizo child, but mestiza marrying an Indio would bear an Indio child. Thus, despite the number of mestiza mothers in the registers, all of the children were classified as Indio. So in the 1883 Molo baptismal registers, ethnicity was provided in all of the essential characters in the entry, such as the parents, the godparents, and the child. Terms such as Indio, Mestizo, Mestizo Sangley, Chino Cristiano, Mestizo Española, Espanyol Peninsular were used in the registers to categorize individual ethnicity. The term, however, was not only an ethnic classification, but also a connotation of legal status. The categories were used in taxation system that definitely evolved throughout the Spanish colonization. So the most familiar and populous among all of these categories was the term Indio, which refers to the native Filipinos born and baptized in the pueblo. Another category is Chino Cristiano. Of course, they were the Chinese that reside in the Philippines and converted to Catholicism. While the other one is Infieles, were non-Christian Chinese who paid higher taxes. And among all identified classification, the Espanyol Peninsular was the highest since they were the Spaniards born in Spain and served or visited the Philippines. So there were two types of mestizo, Mestizo Sangley, Mestizo Española. The first, of course, refers to the mixed Chinese native ancestry or an individual with Filipino and Chinese parents. So this category was established through the frequent intermarriages between Filipino and Chinese merchants. So the Chinese mestizo became a very influential and prominent class in the 19th century. So according to Wickberg in his article, The Chinese Mestizo in Philippine History, he contends that the affluence of the Chinese mestizo led to their social prominence and prestige in their localities. Their wealth made them acquire higher social status than the regular Indios despite their equivalence in legal terms. In relation to this, for the purposes of this study, ethnicity will be used as an indicator of social status. Chinese mestizo would be classified as high socioeconomic status, while Espanyol Peninsular and mestizo would be classified as high socio-political status. But despite the difference, these classes still indicate a high status in the community. So of course,
excuse me, sorry. Can you please wrap up in a bit?
Okay. So the Indio will be the base status among the categories. So let's look at the ethnicity of the godparents. So the majority of the godparents, they were Indio and India, or 84% of all godparents in Molo, Iloilo. While there's a substantial minority of mestizo and mestizo sangley, which is 14%, and just one Chino, Cristiano, and Espanyol Peninsular. So from this, one can infer that the more than 8 out of 10 parents took their social equals as baptismal witnesses, while 15 out of 100 Indio parents selected godparents from their socioeconomic superiors, particularly the mestizo sanglies. So while the selection of mestizo class is not as considerable as the Indio, it's still significant for the fact that none of the 291 set of parents are from the upper class. So let's look at the occupation of the father. So the table shows occupation of the fathers based on the registers. So the composition of the occupation is relatively homogeneous since there is a predominant occupation, which is the jornalero. So in the context of Iloilo, jornalero was not just a common laborer, but a stevedore or port worker, as stated by McCoy. So they were usually paid in cash daily and considered as the nation's new working class. So then some of the fathers are labrador or farmers. Meanwhile, the mothers still the same. Observation can be said of the mothers, like the fathers, 9 out of 10 workers work as jornalera at the time, and some are still weavers despite the decrease in popularity of Iloilo textile. Meanwhile, the godparents, as you can see, unlike the composition of the parents, the occupation of the godparents are more heterogeneous. For one, it is already a combination of the godfather and godmother. That is why there is a significant minority of weavers and almost a majority of laborers. Nevertheless, it's still more varied because aside from laborer, weaver, and farmers, there were 11 other occupations of the godparents. Some of them were traficantes and comerciantes, or the businessmen, while others are sastre and costurera. And even in the register, there are lawyers as godparents. So despite this, the same thing I said to godparents, that its occupational composition was reflective of the time. So as we can see, jornaleros were the most cited in occupation with almost a majority, 46.7%. So in other words, individuals which were laborers were the most preferred in Molo, especially among male children. Despite this, 47% or almost half of all worker parents did not choose a jornalero for a godparent. This means they had other options aside from their co-workers. So among the surnames or the most mentioned surname in the registers, the most mentions are the Guansons, the Yulo, and the Yusay. So you all know these surnames are some of the still influential and powerful names, not just in Iloilo, in Molo, in Haro, but also in the Negros Islands, especially the Guanson. And another familiar name is the Yusay, which is the name of the official name of Molo Mansion or the Yusay Consing Mansion in Iloilo today, which is a landmark in the city. So to conclude, the data analysis interpretation on the ethnicity finds out that 8 out of 10 parents from Molo chose a godparent from the same ethnic identity, which is Indio, while 15 out of 100 selected from the Mestizo Sanglies, a more affluent class. So this is significant considering that there is no single mestizo from the infants. The ethnicity of the parents and godparents was also provided in the registers, and the analysis finds out that 80% of all parents took an Indio, while 15% had selected a Mestizo Sangle as a godparent. So this signifies an affirmation of the historical assertion on the choosing on godparents. Last slide. So meanwhile, with regards to occupational status, while almost half the parents preferred occupational or their colleagues as co-worker, the other half selected someone from a different line of work, or most of them from a higher occupational category than the daily worker or jornalero. This infers that half of the parents chose godparent from a better economic standing, which is another positive affirmation of the historical assertions that are being tested in this study. So to summarize all of these studies findings, it is important to reiterate the primary aim of the study. Going back to the objectives, assertions on the historiography of godparenthood strongly suggest that the orientation of parental choices of godparents tend to concentrate in 2 directions. So first is horizontal, where parents choose among social equals. Second is vertical, particularly in upward direction, which means that parents choose a godparent from the upper social class. In general, parents who baptized their children in Molo in the year 1883 had selected a godparent based in the aforementioned direction. So meanwhile, all of the few elite parents also selected elite godparents. So when I say few, the few political elites. So both of these are instances of horizontalized godparenthood. So okay. So there is also a substantial minority of non-elite Indio who selected elite godparents. So this occurred in at least 10% and 50% across all social categories, which is an example of verticalized godparenthood. Thus, it is not surprising to see that some of the most prominent surnames in the 9th century are still some of the families that are influential today in Molo, in Iloilo, and the Negros Island. In essence, the 1883 Molo godparenthood quantitatively affirmed the historical assertions on the selection of godparents. However, by qualitatively proving the literature, it is not difficult to see why godparenthood is one of the most durable church traditions in history and at the present. Maraming salamat po.
Good day, everyone. I will present my paper entitled Rereading Christianity and Anticolonialism, the Yawa-Yawa Search for the Santo Niño. The purpose of this study is to look at a religious performance practiced in Ibahay Aklan, Philippines, and how Christianity is being articulated and contested. While Christian missionaries used Catholic religion's rituals and festivities as tools of empire, this paper argues that the Yawa-Yawa as a post-colonial performance is a manifestation of how the Filipinos indigenized religion that actually became their language of anti-colonialism. So tracing Christianity, almost 500 years ago, when Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the Philippines, he gifted an image of the Santo Niño to Humabon. In 1565, when Miguel Lopez de Legazpi came back to firmly establish the Philippine archipelago as a province of Spain, they saw the locals worshipping the Santo Niño. According to Mojares, it was seen as a miracle that confirmed the rightness of the Spanish mission to Christianize and colonize the islands. For the Spaniards, the unexpected appearance of the Santo Niño was the sign of divine providence that justified Spanish colonial rule that lasted for more than 3 centuries. Moreover, the Santo Niño divinely authorized the Augustinian mission in Cebu and by extension, the entire Spanish mission in the Philippines. Father Juan Fernandez Monografías de los Pueblos de la Isla de Panay in 1899 and translated in English in 2006 mentioned that it was the Augustinians who first brought Christianity to Aklan in 1581. Similar in Cebu, the Augustinians presumably launched the promotion of the veneration of the Santo Niño. Thus, the narrative of Spanish colonization in the Philippines begins with the Santo Niño. This study documents the religious performance in Ibahay Aklan, Panay Island in Western Visayas, Philippines. So, as Catholic religious rituals and creation of festivals became tools of empire by Spanish missionaries, or what Wendt coins as cultural imperialism. In their campaign to Christianize the natives, missionaries see themselves as soldiers of Christ in a war, saving the natives from the demonic practices of paganism. So, this religious war framework has been prominent, especially in destroying the vestiges of the indigenous past. John Phelan also points that any resemblance between the two religions was dismissed as a diabolical conspiracy in which the devil deceived unbelievers by mimicking the rituals and the beliefs of Christianity. However, this cultural transfer is not a one-way process. The Filipinos modified the foreign elements and combined indigenous traditions. The selective acceptance and adaptation process of the natives reflects what Phelan argues as the process of Filipinizing Catholicism. So the study sees this religious performance as instrumental in resisting imperialism, using the post-colonial drama, theory, practice, politics framework of Helen Gilbert and Joanne Tompkins, 1996. So the post-colonial performance includes the following features. It acts that respond to the direct and indirect response to imperialism, the continuation and or regeneration of the colonized and sometimes pre-contact communities, acts performed with awareness of and sometimes the incorporation of post-contact forms, and an interrogation of the hegemony that underlies imperial representation. In this way, we can reread the Yawa-Yawa performance as a text in order to see the hidden and suppressed voices that are influenced by political agendas of that time. Unlike the ati-atihan, binagyang or sinulog, the Yawa-Yawa do not have the grandeur of a typical festival. It is not commercialized and do not have a tourist audience. But rather, the Yawa-Yawa is performed for the local community. It is a reenactment of Holy Innocents' Day every December 28 by particular barangays in Ibahay Aklan. I have an insider's perspective of growing up with this tradition as an Ibayhanon. For this paper, I utilized ethnography as a method, and I did my ethnographic fieldwork in December 2017 and December 2019 in Maloco, Ibahay. Emphasis should be given on last year's performance because the town was badly hit by Typhoon Ursula, and yet the community continued the tradition. I also observed the making of the costumes prior to the performance. And while some adjacent barangays also observed the performance, they were not as organized as Maloco that claims to follow decades-old tradition. I also tried to trace the historical beginnings of the performance using the undergraduate thesis by Marvy Malihan in 2010 and the unpublished works of local historians Liberata del Carmen's The History of Yawa-Yawa in 1968 and Teresita Jongson's Yawa-Yawa in 1970. Based on these written accounts, the celebration of the Yawa-Yawa or Niños Inocentes took place in early 1890s. These works describe how and why the performance is being celebrated and the origin and development of the performance. In Johnson's work, for instance, she notes that the people's celebration is associated with loyalty to Christianity. Based on my interview with one of the oldest residents of Maloco, Castora Salido, who was 92 years old in 2017, she remembers that they were already celebrating the performance since she was still a child. We can conclude that the performance is being celebrated at least by 4 generations. So the context of this celebration, so there's a biblical story in the verses of Luke wherein the angels appeared to the shepherds who told them about the birth of Jesus Christ. The shepherds paid homage to the baby Jesus and told everyone about the Messiah. In Matthew, the wise men also was looking for the newborn king, and they thought they would find him in the palace of King Herod. Herod, who was frightened that a child king is going to replace him, ordered the massacre of newly born male children ages 2 years and below. This is what is known as the Childermas or the Feast of the Holy Innocents every December 28. So who is the Yawa? The term Yawa in Visayan language means devil or demon or someone who is evil. Yawa also means pagan or non-converted native. So in Scott's barangay, he mentions that the Yawa was a general term for demons which came to be adopted for non-Christians. For example, Yawa ka pa? Are you still pagan? Additionally, Scott also cited Father Mentrida's report on the presence of Ugima or man-shaped demons that were widely seen in Aklan and Ibahay in 1600 and before 1599. So now let's proceed to the Yawa costume and props. The Yawa resembles, or the performer resembles the Yawa by wearing masks made of gunot or coconut husk and hihok palm fiber, which they paint in red and black. The masks incorporate thick eyebrows, horns, long tongues, and other daunting features. The identity of the Yawa is strictly hidden. He will not take off his mask all day except when he eats or drinks water. Once he takes off his mask, he must practice caution, or else the children will no longer be afraid of him. The Yawa brings makeshift karit and sanduko as weapons or props to scare young children. Some folks practice gapakarit itliog sa Yawa or the Yawa symbolic cutting of one's neck. This practice is believed to have a healing purpose, especially for babies to grow healthy. Moreover, if we observe, these weapons are also used as farming tools. To further hide their identity, the Yawa wears long robes, capes, and dresses like the daster that are often owned by their female relatives. Though the woman cannot be a performer, she still has an involvement in the performance with the daster. So as they move around, the performers in their hoarse and loud voices shouts, Yawa, Palay, Kwarta, or meaning demon, palay, money. Their arrival is accompanied by drums or the percussion instrument. According to Wend, percussion instruments now are used to signal the start of some festivals in the Philippines, but were probably used long ago for calling on the gods. The Yawa searches for the Holy Child or the Santo Niño in the houses at the village. If they cannot find the Santo Niño, they will ask for palay in the earlier times. According to some informants, even hand clothes can be taken by the Yawa. At present, the Yawa prefers cash, and sometimes people also give them food. If they seize the Santo Niño, they can demand a ransom money. That is why the faithful make sure that the Santo Niño is in a safe place. So this allowed commandeering is accepted and widely anticipated by the village community in Maloco and townsfolk in Ibahay every December 28. Furthermore, the fear of the Yawa is also part of the values formation of the children in the village. So parents remind their children to be in their best behavior or else the Yawa will take them. I would also like to compare the Yawa-Yawa performance with the Moriones Festival performed during the Lenten season in Marinduque. Both replicates and interprets the Roman soldiers and are performed in the streets. They scare young children and occasionally flirts with young women. All male performers wear masks, and they not only represented Roman soldiers, but perhaps even Spanish conquistadores. In his study of the Moriones, Wendt mentions that masks had the potential to criticize authority. While the Yawa-Yawa performance is merely a reenactment, the form of commandeering, like taking harvested palay or money, may represent the collection of tributes or even forced labor during the Spanish colonial times. The portrayal of the Yawa as soldiers manifests a strong hatred or condemnation of the acts performed. Thus, when you say Yawa ka in a canon or in similar Visayan languages, it connotes a strong emotional feeling of hate. The costumes as well as the performance itself shows how the Filipinos indigenized or owned the Christian religion and come up with their own interpretation of the said biblical event. We can also see gender representations in the performance. The all-male Yawa are executing violence as performativity in a public space and widely tolerated and accepted. The emphasis on the loud and hoarse voice imposes masculinity and authority. Interestingly, the performers wear the duster or long robes to hide their identity. While the duster is the most easily accessible costume that they can use, we can draw alternative explanations. First, the Yawa wearing the duster may represent the demonization of the woman. When the missionaries came, the woman, as the babaylan or the mediator between mortals and deities, was the friar's rival in the native spirituality, to the extent that the Spaniards persecuted and eliminated the babaylan. Second, in relation to demonizing the woman, the Yawa was probably celebrating the babaylan by imitating the woman's religious and healing function, suppressed and hidden in the performance, but apparent in the long red robes and the healing power of the karit. Hence, the Yawa-Yawa as a post-colonial performance is a direct and indirect response to the elimination of pagan practices and persecution of the babaylan. The performers indigenize many facets of the biblical event through the costumes, practices, and gendered representations. By Filipinizing, the colonized was able to take ownership of this cultural transfer. So if the popular narrative of Christianity was saving the natives from the devil through conversion, then how do we interpret the colonized using the image of the devil or the Yawa to portray the Roman soldiers who wanted to kill the child Jesus? Clearly, we see not only the hybridization or syncretic element of culture, but the Yawa-Yawa performance seems like a satirical take by the colonized to expose the violence, abuses, and harsh brutalities brought by imperialism. They use their selective adaptation of Christianity as a form of resistance, or what Rinaldo Eleto coins as their language of anti-colonialism. To conclude, the study of religious beliefs, practices, and performances revealed interrogations and discourses on Philippine culture and identity, most especially as current religious festivals evolved and are often used for economic, tourism, and political agenda. In the study, we reread the religious performance using the lens of post-colonial theater and gender studies. Additionally, I would also like to emphasize the importance of studying local histories and the lives of ordinary people, as they are often absent actors in the national narrative. Maabong gid nga salamat. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Thea. And for the final presenter of our panel, may we have Sarah Toraldo. Sarah.
Hi, sir. Hello. I'll share my screen.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, sir. May I leave my video off when presenting? Hello?
It's up to you. If you want to
Yes.
turn your video off,
It's because I'm having trouble with connection, sir. So I'll
no
just
problem.
turn
It's
on.
okay.
Okay, see. Thanks.
Whatever's more convenient. Thank
Okay,
you.
sir. I will share my screen. Are you seeing the screen, sir?
Not yet.
Not yet. So, share.
There.
There. Okay. So.
So please shift to slideshow so that we
Yes.
can see it clearly. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the paper that I'll be presenting is about examining images of children in primary school textbooks in Spanish Philippines. Before I finished this paper, however, and before I set off to become an art teacher, I was working with communities in Eastern Samar for a Child Rights International NGO. It was there that I encountered this picture book, sa mga kantada at Tututlong Haragan, and this was used in the primary instruction, and this was read by the children in Eastern Samar, which they read among themselves after dinner. This picture book the illustration employs a very graphic style and very straightforward lines, because it's understandably to make it more entertaining and amusing. But if you look more closely, you would see that there was a contrast between the way the adult figure was illustrated in contrast with the children who were given bloated heads and bloated arms, as opposed to the Encantada, who has a well-proportioned figure. Now, this picture book was illustrated by two artists who were described as the first illustrators for the premier publisher for books for children. And this was published by the Nutrition Center of the Philippines as a prototype of Aklat Adarna in 1980. And according to Eugene Ibasco, this was part of the Marcos administration's mental feeding program, following after the former First Lady and Manila Governor Imelda Marcos's projects. So according to Eugene Ibasco's semiotic study on picture books, this was corroborated by the hairstyle of the Encantada in the dress and the story about wastefulness and destructiveness. Now, Eugene Vasco argued that this depiction does not make the story simply about environmental conversation, but one that molds the consciousness of the children in the creation of the new society, which is separate from the real crisis, which should be cleaned up. If I would advance, I would say that this molding of the consciousness of children includes also the changing of the form of the body, not only of the adult figure, but especially and most especially of the children. Now, I started with this picture book, even if it's not situated in the colonial history or in the colonial education of the Philippines, because it examines, it addresses, it is central to what this paper aims to address, which is how children are imaged in cultural documents that are produced specifically for them, and to ask what produced this images and imaging as a context, and to find out if there were responses to this production and intention of the imaging and images. Now, this amalgamation of adult features and childlike submission in the children's bodies actually comes from or are produced in the ways adults were addressed and treated and are enjoined to behave under the light of authority, like children, and this was pejoratively speaking. Now, addressing or treating children and adults like children and children like adults was a strategy of the colonial imperial powers in the colonial history in the Philippines in justifying and proceeding with the colonization, civilization, and conversion processes. The Spanish perspective here is that the Indian will always be a grown-up child, but with all the passions, vices, and defects of the adult. Now, the picture book formalizes the defects of the colonial systems and the colonial institutions. The picture book formalizes the defects of the two life stages. First is the weakness and lack of knowing of a child and the corrupted and lustful ways of the adult. So in contrast, the way that the Encantada was presented here, it was given a well-proportioned figure and a visual asymmetrical depiction. It represents the powerful proponent of this new society. So here, the Marcos regime fashions itself as a reformatory new society that envisions its citizens to be capable of being disciplined. And because this book was also generously funded by the central government under Ferdinand Marcos and through the Nutrition Center of the Philippines. So they produced pamphlets to parents and educators on the importance of mental nutrition, and it was eventually established as a collection of paperbacks written in Filipino by Filipino writers and for Filipino children. So here, state discipline appears in the way the bodies were transformed from adult deformed subversion to childlike apologetic submission at the sleight of the hand. Now, this is important because the imaging of this authority figure is significant in the colonial situation where both the identity of the colonizer and colonized were manufactured. So after all, colonialism is predicated on the creation of images and myths of the colonized to justify colonization and make sense of the subjugation. Now, in this paper, it is my hope that I could provide an art historical perspective to topics that straddles history and education, childhood studies, and literature. It is also my hope that it would contribute to the body of colonial scholarship that rewrites colonial narratives and starts scholarship on the subject marginalized in Philippine art history, which is children. Now, in Philippine art, children featured consistently as subjects. There were so many, but I have decided to situate this study on textbooks and not paintings or artworks because I wanted to make the colonial visible, where children experience colonial power. Now, before I answer these questions, I'd like to share first how I came about, how I specifically wanted to look at bodies of children in the images in primary textbooks. Now, I read Olivia Ann Havana's dissertation on Filipino children, the transformation of Filipino childhood, which is I have enjoyed thoroughly and was very incendiary with this work. So I'm very thankful for the inspiration in proceeding with this paper. So in that dissertation, one of her primary sources was Philip Arce in the Centuries of Childhood. So in this work, Arce prefaced his work by saying that he described an Ottonian miniature in which, as an example of the deformation in which an artist at that time would inflict on children's bodies. According to Philip Arce, children were illustrated like miniature adults. There was no difference with the expression with the adults and the children except of scale. So children here were illustrated or painted like miniature or small scale adults. This supports his famous claim that there was no place for childhood in the medieval world. He would add that at that time, a painter would not hesitate in giving the naked body of a child the musculature of an adult. So again, supporting his claim that there was no place for childhood. There's no childhood back then. Now, this opens the idea that it is only when artists started depicting children in the classical and realistic figuration that there would be a place for childhood in the world. But more than the idea of the non-existence of childhood towards its discovery, I was more taken with the way our Arce used the word inflict as to wear and deformation into bodies. So it opened to me the idea that when you put adult features and child figures, it is a kind of violation or violence even. This is important because in Catechism of the Body, Russell Mujeres defined colonialism as not just about founding of towns, extraction of tributes, or exploitation of natural resources, but also and most especially about the production of docile, decorous, and useful bodies. So what produced these docile bodies and how? Starting in the 1550s, Spain already expressed great interest in the education of the natives. We could see this by the several laws that were passed, laws concerning native schools, which emphasizes the learning of the Castilian language. And their tributes were requested to be donated to schools, and kings ordered missionaries to teach Spanish and the Christian doctrine, build schoolhouses, and compel children to attend school. Now, however, it is important to note that when the Royal Decree of 1863, which formalizes the primary instruction in the Philippines, it was when it's being drafted, when the government was taking such great pains in the education under its protection by special legislation, Spain is actually losing the Philippines. This is because there were two problems that were arising in that century. First, there was the agitation for reforms by the new rich illustrative class, and there were restlessness from the basic masses. This comes from the Spanish exploitation and the abuse of the natives. Now, while the insular government sought to popularize Spanish and secularize education, the friars persisted in a rabid brutalization of the masses that would keep them subservient to the bureaucracy. However, the learn Spanish remained anchored only so that they may become capable of the mastery of our Catholic faith and salvation. So the object of elementary instruction was to produce docile and God-fearing men and women who follow blindly the counsel of their priests and confessors. So while the textbooks were divided into encyclopedic books, primers, and storybooks, all of these has religious content, and the idea of colonial education was rote memorization, and the pupils did not really learn that much Spanish. So much so that 26 years after the Royal Decree of Education of 1863 was passed, when it enforced a free and compulsory primary education for all, including the teaching of Spanish, Jose Rizal has to write to the Malolos women when they express their desire to learn Spanish and to petition for them to learn Spanish. Now, what conjures this colonial classroom best would be Rizal's novel Noli Me Tangere, which was written and published 23 years after the Royal Decree of 1863, which critiques the educational system and institution and enumerates the problems in the colonial schools. So according to him, the school was a place for suffering, and this is not just on the part of the pupils, but the teachers as well. One book there was mentioned, the Cartilia, and it was described as soaked to the tears of childhood. Now, in looking for all the books that were used in the primary instruction in the colonial period, Spanish colonial period, not all textbooks survive, and some of them were lost to hazard, earthquakes, and wars. But I was able to find seven textbooks in Manila from the special collections in the universities in Manila, and there's only one book, which is the Páginas de la Infancia, which I found from Biblioteca Digital España, from the Biblioteca Nacional de España. So how are children imaged in primary school textbooks? In primary school textbooks, most of the illustrations were found in the frontispieces and in the selections in the storybooks. But if you notice here, when children were imaged, almost always they were accompanied by adults. The adults here are authority figures, either parents or teachers. And you could see that there was a kind of a template that they follow, especially in Páginas de la Infancia, in which even if these illustrations were illustrated by different artists, they have striking similarities to each other. So like this, there were two girls, there's one girl on this one image, and there's another girl. They were both flanked by adults and children. And here, both of the boys here are looking up to an authority figure, an adult. And if you notice here, if the children were not with adults, if they were with adults, they were either bowing down or looking up to the adult. And if they are alone, they would be accompanied by Christian iconography like crosses. Now, what's most interesting, which I found in the illustration, was a frontispiece from La Escuela de Instrucción Primaria. This best demonstrates la letra con sangre entra. Literally, it means letters enter by blood, or the practice of corporal punishment in the colonial education. Now, la letra con sangre entra was also a painting by Francisco Goya. If you notice here, there is a teacher who's about to whip a boy. There's a girl who's holding up the clothes and then exposing the buttocks. There are two children who are whipping. There's one boy who is kneeling, but the others are completely absorbed with schoolwork. Now, both of these images have striking similarities to each other, but the first one is more of a critique. Francisco Goya's work or paintings more of a critique, especially that when it was exhibited, it was mentioned that it is actually a parody or a critique of the Spanish education. However, I would say that the latter work was a myth-making device. It was unsaturated and is subdued, not only because it has no color, but it has the absence of the elements that you could see in Goya's painting. So in Goya's painting, there was a glorious contradiction. There was the screaming images of the buttocks, the suspended whip, there were crying children, the barking dog, and this was contradicted with the girl who's holding the clothes, the girl's nonchalant face, the eerie concentration of the other children with the open door. The other image has no contradiction, no suggestion of tension, there's no movement or violence despite the punishing positions. So if you notice here, there are students who are standing and kneeling, and from the royal decree of 1863, these are the kinds of punishments that were exacted to children. So here, it transforms the colonial classroom into a church-like sanctuary for reverence, silence, and attention. So were there any negotiations or response from these images and these illustrations? So aside from Pardo de Tavera's memoirs chronicling the colonial classroom, in which he talks about corporal punishment, the response happened much later when Jose Rizal translated Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, which he also illustrated, and this is for his nephews and his nieces. According to the letter, these are translations which Rizal hoped for his nieces and nephews to read, to write, and memorize with joy, and to share with fellow children. So the manuscript was written entirely in his own script, and then it was interspersed with illustrations done with his own hand. It was about 40 pages, and it was bound in leather. And later it was published by the Bureau of Public Libraries in 1954, and in 1984 by the Philippine Books for Young People, Philippine Board of Books for Young People. Now, here, Jose Rizal is specifically illustrated children. What's really significant with this work was that Rizal did not just illustrated for children, he also illustrated children. So one specific story, Ang Puno ng Pino, which is the pine tree, he illustrated children threading strawberries with hay. He illustrated children, they were surrounding the Christmas tree, and he illustrated a boy with a gold star who is trampling onto the branches of the tree. He also illustrated Kahin Lalaki, and she is riding the bird, and she is finally free from her fate of marrying a mole. And he also illustrated German boys in his comics, and also the puti or naked children in his Tagalog story, The Monkey and the Tortoise. Now, Jose Rizal's illustration countered the practice of corporal punishment that were rendered normative in the colonial school. This was anchored in the Christian narrative of suffering through the body. So the illustrations, the images in picture books, the children were illustrated as towered by adults. They were exacted with punishment. They were placed in the sphere of authority. They were always adults, and they were imaged in passive and submissive body positions. However, In contrast, Jose Rizal illustrated children in states of play. They were among themselves, states of curiosity, attention, freedom, and subversion even. So the disordering of the colonial images was the most powerful indication that while the goals of conquest and colonial education centered on making the bodies docile, it did not really fully succeed because a literal rising of bodies transpired. So the illustrations, along with Risa Rizal's other writings, the Noli, the Fili, his letter to the Malolos women, and to his goals to create classrooms or in schools and his treatises, his illustrations actually changed the colonial narrative and West provoked the anti-Spanish Revolution, in which actually demonstrates a literal rising of the bodies through the anti-Spanish Revolution. So that's it.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all our 5 presenters for this panel. We are now in the question and answer portion, and we are asking for your questions, especially from the members of this panel, members of the audience. You may use the raise your hand function of Zoom. We have a question from Philip Gerhel Ayad, addressed to Dr. Lacson. Were women of all social classes supportive? I think or did women of all social classes support the progressive views of feminism, or were there those who loved their quote unquote chain? Also, how about the men?
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question. Basically, not everybody supported the progressive views of feminism. As you can see a while ago, I presented a lady named Amparo Neri, who was really actually anti-suffrage. No? And there will be so many stories about women who will not be for it. And then at the same time, just to balance it off, there will also be men who were actually helping the women get out of their chains, so to speak. No? Manuel Rojas would be one of them. No? And Palma would also be another. No? So it's so I hope I answered your question with that. No, that all social classes supported the progressive views of feminism. There were those in all classes who supported it, and there were those in all classes who didn't support it. And the same thing with the men. There were men who were actually supportive of this idea of feminism, the same way that there were men like Recto who wasn't. So that's it.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Philip, for posing that question. Others from the members of the audience? From Dr. Lou de Leon Bolinao, question for Rita and Kate. It's interesting to know how laws and politics help shape the image and function of a woman's body. I was curious, however, why there was hardly any mention of religion or the church in building up this social construct and the apparent acquiescence and quiet submission of the women during this period. Rita, can you be the first one to answer?
Thank you for the question, Ma'am Lu, Dr. Bolinao. In prostitution and in abortion, we know that these are crimes because they disturb the moral fabric of the moral order, the moral fabric of a society. It's not that they are silent, but that, of course, the church has its own laws that will castigate those particular crimes. But then it's two-pronged because there are also state laws that control or that take care of those who make these violations. So there is mention, if we are to look at mention of the religious aspect of this, if we were to look at the decisions concerning these crimes. Quiet submission with prostitution, it was criminalized, yes, but it was also regulated for because it was revenue generating. So even if the state and the church recognizes the crime, on the other side, it's the state who also exacts or earns from that practice, from the practice of that trade. So that's it. No, that is the very peculiar way, no, by which the prostitution was carried out. On one hand, okay, it's castigated by the church and the state, but on the other, the state makes money off of it. Dr. Lacson, I hope I was able to answer your question, Dr. Bolinaw.
Good afternoon, Dr. Bolinaw. Thanks, Rita. Basically, I just have to, because the thing that I specifically talked about a while ago was about the bobbed hair, right? Interestingly enough, the church was actually for it. The Pope, everybody was so surprised, no, to find out in the periodicals that the Pope was for bobbed hair. But there were some moralists who were saying that the Pope was for bobbed hair for the simple reason that he thought, so that women won't be as attractive, no? But these are already the detractors. And in fact, a lot of the priests during that time were also for bobbed hair. But they just wanted to make sure that if you go inside the church, what happens is that you have to wear the right outfit. So I hope that sort of balances it off.
Thank you very much, Kate and Rita. And then we have Dr. Lian Nabana, who has a question for Sarah. I would like to commend you for your work on the visual representation of children in textbooks. Will there be similar visual images in religious texts like prayer books or doctrinas, which were also used for teaching? And then Dr. Lacson, a follow-up from Philip, which class was more progressive? So can we begin with Sarah?
Hello, Dr. Habana. I found there were also images in prayer books or doctrinas, but most of these illustrations were decorative ones. They were like flowers and there were religious images, but there were really not much visual representations of children.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, to answer Philip's question about which class was more progressive, actually, this is going to be, it's very complicated to explain it, no? But the thing is, kasi when we talk about when we talk about the images in the periodicals, you would look at it and say that the more progressive classes were supposed to be the ones coming from the upper and middle classes. But the thing is, you also have to understand the representations that were happening in that specific space, no? So in other words, what happens there is that again, the issues of who's represented, right? But the thing is, if you look deeper, you would notice that even those who are coming supposedly from the lower classes, they were also very progressive and they were also going towards this modernity. It's just that the images that are more manifested in the periodicals would be coming from the upper and middle, but it doesn't necessarily follow that those that were coming from the middle and the lower middle and lower classes weren't as progressive as well, no? So that's it.
And Kate, can you address this follow-up question from Dr. Bolinaw? There was church acceptance of the bob hair, but this was offset by the veil.
Actually, that's one of the things that they would, because they would have this parang post, the way this we see right now in the churches, that they would say that this is how you should look, right? So this is what you should wear, that you shouldn't wear that flapper, very mini skirt type of things, not the flapper look. And they would say that, yes, that's another one of the offsets is to use the veil. But the thing is, a lot of the priests during that time were really not very much against it, especially since the Pope was not against it. No, but then again, the utilization of clothes and accessories of those clothes helped out in balancing it. So,
thank you, Kate. And I will now turn to the Facebook live stream comments section. I have two questions here for Thea. One from Sashing. I would like to ask Thea if there were changes in the performance, costumes, and other elements of Yawa-Yawa, and if there were, what caused them? And then the second question is, thanks so much for your research on the child's body and Yawa-Yawa. I'm curious as to the roles of racism and regionalism in these texts, whether Visayaness, Chineseness, Malayness, Blackness, Whiteness, etc. Thea? Thea, we can't hear you. I think your mic is disconnected because you're no longer on mute.
Okay. Can you hear
There.
me?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So there are a lot of changes in the performance. So before, the performance was not as organized. In 2017, when I started my ethnography, the barangay council of Maloco already started organizing the performers. So this is one of their ways so that they could actually control the performers, because there are instances that the performers, if they go to the town, they would actually stop the buses and they would enter the bus. And then some, of course, the tourists who are not familiar, or they would mistake it for like a hold up or whatsoever. So one way was to actually organize the performers, and that's what happened in 2017. And like openly gay men or join the performance. So they would even have more intricate designs in their costumes. Sometimes it would even look like an Iron Man type of costume. So there are a lot of changes. And when they are being asked, if I actually asked the question, why there's no women in the performance, and of course they don't really have an answer. They would just keep on saying that it's always been like this, but since starting 2017, I think, when openly gay men joined the performance, it was okay for them. So for as long as you are biologically male, you can join the performance. And I think for the second question about racism, I didn't really look into racism. I'm sorry, what's the question again?
The question was about if there were roles played by racism and regionalism in these texts.
I think in terms of regionalism, I haven't encountered any similar performance like this one with other Visayan with other provinces. So one way probably to look at it is that the strong connotation of the Yawa in the Visayan, and when it was actually just it was interesting for me when I found about how Scott cited the presence of Ogima or the Yawa in barangay, and he actually mentioned Ibahay and Aklan. So I think the presence of the Babaylanism resonates more in the Visayan area. That's the reason why. But in terms of racism, I haven't really looked into it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Thea. The next question for Alvin, coming from Dr. Lou Bolinao. In choosing godparents, there was also no mention if the choices were qualified to give spiritual advice to the child, i.e. religiosity. Are we assuming that it was not as important as having a steady occupation, which is not actually the job description of a godparent? And then also directed to Alvin from Teresita Angsi, the one on Molo. Do you have information on the time Ogtong used to be the capital of the entire Panay region and was a very busy port before Iloilo City became the hub of commerce?
Thank you for the questions. By the way, Ma'am Lu was hi Ma'am Lu. Ma'am Lu was my critic in my thesis. So in choosing godparents, actually, to answer your question, ma'am, there are no specific qualifications that were stated in the canon law that was used by the church. I think the more qualification or requirement that a godparent needs to have is, for example, the age. That's why usually a godparent is of the same age of his or her co-parent. And occupation, it's not also stated in the canon law, but historically these qualifications were mentioned in the previous canon laws, especially during medieval period up to before the Council of Trent. There are qualifications such as the ability to sponsor a child. For example, there were someone in the church who will check if a child is fit enough to be baptized, for example, especially if the child was not baptized during his or her infancy. So there's someone in the church who will check the godparents. But in the Philippines, there is no strict requirement for a godparent as long as you're a practicing Catholic. So that's it. So for Ma'am Teresita, there were many articles on the information regarding the time of Ogtong, as actually Ogtong before it became a pueblo in the town of Iloilo. It was a name used for the whole province of Iloilo. It was eventually changed when the area was developed into a larger town and divided into different pueblos. And I think there are numerous publications, especially by Dr. Henry Fontecha of University of the Philippines, Visayas, and of course the article by Almacoy in Philippine Social History. And so I'll answer.
Yeah, sure, Alvin, go ahead. Please answer. I'd just like to read it out loud for the benefit of our live stream viewers. To Alvin, do we have qualitative descriptions of what godparenthood was like for either the padrino or the godchild in the 19th century, or where might we start to look for these sources?
Oh, that's a good question. So actually, it's one of the limitations of the topic, but as mentioned, for example, in secondary sources, in more general history articles, for example, some of them would mention that some of the godparents, they were the affluent family. For example, the Chinese, in not just in Iloilo but in Manila, were using their godchild to expand their influence. That's why in the 17th century, the Chinese were actually banned from being godparent because they were just using their godchild for secular purposes. But in the 19th century, I think the data is not actually, there was a dearth of data for the 19th century. But it's very usual that godparenthood was used to strengthen alliances, and of course, it was used to for secular purposes and not really for religious purposes. So that's all.
Thank you, Alvin. Other questions from the members of this panel, from the members of the audience? I think I'd just like to go back to Sarah, because the earlier question posed referred to Thea, I think also refers to you, Sarah, regarding the issues of the roles of racism and regionalism in texts pertaining to how children's bodies were being referred to or depicted. Were there cases of racism, regionalism, Sarah, in the different texts that you analyzed? Hi, Sarah. We can't hear you loudly. There seems to be distortion in your. Hi, Sarah. Sarah, your audio is. Sorry, Sarah, we can't hear you.
I also studied about I also looked in
Sorry, Sarah, the audio is really bad. Is it possible for you to type your answer to the question? You can find it in the comment section of our Facebook live stream. You can type it here in our chat box for the benefit of everyone in the Zoom meeting. There's also a follow-up question for Thea. What caused the changes that she mentioned? What caused the changes that you mentioned in your answer to the previous question?
I think one of the changes, of course, is social media. Many of the town folks and the villagers would post with the Yawa. So there is more of the community now is more conscious about the performance because it's being post online, and sometimes you would even encounter a lot of debate whether why this particular village or the people from Ibahay would perform such a demonic performance. So if you are not from Ibahay, you will not really understand the story behind the performance. So changes, take for example with the costumes. Of course, this already influenced by media, and at the same time, uh, the openness to the LGBT community. So I think that's one thing that I figured in my 2017 ethnography, that the performers or the group of men are welcoming the gays, and they are actually the center of the attraction because they have intricate designs and their costumes. So it's both social media and the changing times that wherein the performance was able also to adapt to the changes and at the same time address to the wider audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Thea, for answering the question. And there's another are there questions coming from the members of the audience? Another follow-up question for Thea. How is it anti-colonial if the antagonist of the performance is the non-Christianized indigenous figure? Also coming from our Facebook live stream comment section. Thea?
I think anti-colonial in a way that the people own the performance. They own it has syncretic elements of Christianity, and at the same time, as I've mentioned, the performance actually celebrates a lot of indigenous practices like the percussion, the wearing of long robes, and as I said, the men wearing the long robes or even the duster is actually a reflection or a manifestation and a celebration of the woman. It's either demonizing the woman or celebrating the woman, and as the babaylan, wherein during the Spanish colonial times they were demonized, they were eliminated. So in this performance, they were able to somehow celebrate. So the women are hidden. They are not in the performance. The performance is primarily all male performers, but the symbolic duster in the performance speaks a lot of the visibility of the female in that performance. So I hope I answered the question.
Yes. Thank you, Thea. Thank you for answering the question. Are there other questions from the members of the audience? Because if there are none, I think that should be it for our last session of the conference. We are thankful on behalf of the journal Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. We want to thank Rita, Sarah, Kate, Thea, and Alvin for taking their time to present their papers, for all their insightful presentations. And of course, thank you to everyone here in the audience still joining us here in the conference, for the lively discussions, for the very insightful questions as well. Thank you very much for your active participation. We still have the closing remarks to be delivered by the chief editor of Philippine Studies. We will move to that in a bit. So just be on standby. Please stay tuned. We will still have the closing remarks. But for the meantime, let me just end the panel here. Once again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon, probably in another Zoom meeting, or perhaps in the typical, in a more average or usual conference. We are really thankful that despite the pandemic, you still took the time to be with us here. We are thankful for your participation. So please stay tuned. We will have the closing ceremonies, the closing remarks by Dr. Aguilar in a bit. So thank you very much, and yeah, please stay tuned.